In 60 minutes, 268 American soldiers would be dead, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition on a blood-soaked Montana hillside. The man who led them to slaughter was about to make the worst military decision in American history. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer crested the ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley, his golden hair catching the afternoon sun one final time. What happened in the next hour would shatter the mythology of American invincibility forever. Recent archaeological evidence and forensic analysis have revealed that Custer's final moments were far more brutal and chaotic than history books dared to record. The truth is darker than we imagined. Chapter 1: The Fatal Miscalculation. The morning of June 25, 1876 began with omens that any reasonable commander would have heeded. Bloody Knife, Custer's most trusted scout, had spent the pre-dawn hours studying the massive trail left by Sitting Bull's people. The half-Arikara tracker's weathered face bore the expression of a man who had seen his own death approaching. "Too many," Bloody Knife signed to Custer in the pale morning light. "More than leaves on trees. We should wait for the other soldier chiefs." But George Armstrong Custer was not a reasonable man. He was a creature of pure ambition, driven by an insatiable hunger for glory that had consumed him since his days as the youngest general in the Union Army. At 36, he had already survived more battles than most soldiers would see in 3 lifetimes. Yet, he remained desperately hungry for the one victory that would cement his place in history. Archaeological evidence from the 1980s revealed the true scope of what awaited Custer in the valley below. Modern analysis of the campsite shows that over 8,000 Native Americans had gathered along the Little Bighorn River. This was not just a village, it was a military coalition the likes of which had never been assembled on the Great Plains. At least 2,000 warriors, armed with repeating rifles and intimate knowledge of the terrain, waited in the largest Native American war camp ever recorded. Yet when his scouts brought him this intelligence, Custer dismissed it with the arrogance that would doom every man under his command. Charlie Reynolds and other experienced frontiersmen confirmed Bloody Knife's warnings about the enemy's overwhelming numbers, but Custer's response was chilling in its dismissal of reality. "I have fought Indians before," Custer declared. "They cannot stand against disciplined cavalry charges. We will scatter them like leaves before the wind." This fatal miscalculation was rooted in more than mere arrogance. Custer's career had been built on aggressive tactics and personal bravery, but his recent assignments on the frontier had yielded little of the glory he craved. The massacre at Washita River in 1868 had been his last significant victory, and even that had been tainted by controversy when he abandoned Major Joel Elliott and his men to their deaths. Now, facing potential court-martial for his unauthorized testimony before Congress about corruption in the Indian agencies, Custer needed a victory so decisive that it would restore his reputation and secure his political future. The massive gathering of Native Americans represented either his greatest triumph or his complete destruction. The decision to divide his already outnumbered forces revealed the depth of Custer's tactical blindness. Against an enemy that potentially outnumbered him 4-1, he chose to split his command into 3 separate units. Major Marcus Reno would lead 3 companies in a frontal assault from the south. Captain Frederick Benteen would take 3 companies on a wide sweep to the west. Custer himself would lead 5 companies around to the north. This plan might have worked against a small, surprised camp of a few hundred people. Against 2,000 seasoned warriors who had been expecting an attack for weeks, it was military suicide. Modern military analysts studying the battle have concluded that Custer's tactical decisions violated every principle of sound military leadership. As the 3 columns separated on that fateful morning, Custer's orderly, John Martin, carried what would be the last written message from the doomed commander. The hastily scribbled note to Captain Benteen read, "Come on, big village, be quick. Bring packs." These words, preserved in military archives, represent the moment when Custer finally realized the magnitude of his error. The trap had been set months earlier when Sitting Bull had sent word across the plains, calling for all 3 tribes to gather for one final stand against American expansion. Unlike previous Native American resistance movements, this coalition was disciplined, well-armed, and led by brilliant military minds. Sitting Bull himself was not just a war leader, but a spiritual guide whose visions had predicted this very confrontation. His lieutenant, Gall, was a tactical genius who understood how to use terrain to maximize their advantages. And then there was Crazy Horse, the young Oglala warrior whose unconventional tactics had already defeated General Crook at the Battle of the Rosebud just 8 days earlier. As Custer's column rode toward their destiny, They were not just facing another Indian village, they were riding into the most sophisticated military trap ever devised by Native American forces. Every ridge, every gully, every bend in the river had been scouted and prepared. Warriors were positioned to channel the advancing soldiers into carefully prepared killing zones. The final irony was that Custer's own success had contributed to his downfall. His reputation for aggressive tactics and his past victories over smaller Native American groups had made him the perfect target for Sitting Bull's trap. The Lakota and Cheyenne leaders knew exactly what kind of man they were facing, a glory-seeking cavalry officer who would never retreat from a fight, no matter how hopeless the odds. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer crested the final ridge, overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley. What he saw spread before him should have sent him racing back to find reinforcements. Instead, he raised his hat above his head and shouted the words that would echo through history, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them!" In that moment, the die was cast. The greatest military disaster in American frontier history was about to unfold. Chapter 2. The Slaughter Begins. The first shots of the Battle of Little Bighorn rang out at 3:30 in the afternoon, but they did not come from where George Armstrong Custer expected. Major Marcus Reno's southern assault had encountered not a sleeping village, but a fully prepared defensive position where hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors waited in concealment along the riverbank. Reno's men, already unnerved by the massive size of the enemy encampment, found themselves riding directly into a carefully orchestrated ambush. The archaeological evidence recovered from the battlefield tells a story of immediate and catastrophic military collapse. Spent cartridge cases found scattered across the approach to the village revealed that many soldiers fired their weapons in wild, undisciplined volleys that accomplished nothing except to alert the entire Native American force to their presence. Bloody Knife, riding beside Major Reno as his chief scout, was among the first to recognize the hopelessness of their situation. The veteran tracker, who had spent years fighting alongside American forces, understood immediately that they had walked into a trap that would consume them all. His warnings came too late. The moment that defined the battle's brutal character occurred when a Lakota sniper, concealed among the cottonwoods along the riverbank, drew a careful bead on the distinctive figure of Bloody Knife. The scout was in mid-sentence, trying to convince the increasingly panicked Major Reno to order an immediate retreat when the heavy-caliber bullet struck him in the back of the head. Eyewitness accounts from the few survivors of Reno's charge describe the horrific scene in vivid detail. The impact of the bullet caused Bloody Knife's skull to explode like a ripe melon, spraying blood, bone fragments, and brain matter across Major Reno's face and uniform. The gruesome baptism of gore marked the moment when military discipline finally collapsed entirely. Reno, already compromised by his heavy drinking throughout the morning, was psychologically shattered by the death of his most trusted advisor. Covered in the blood and brains of his friend, the major began screaming contradictory orders to his men. Some soldiers later testified that Reno appeared to be having a complete mental breakdown, alternately calling for charges and retreats within the span of seconds. The Native American response was swift and overwhelming. Gall, Sitting Bull's brilliant military strategist, had positioned his warriors to funnel the attacking soldiers into a deadly crossfire. As Reno's men struggled to maintain their battle line, hundreds of mounted Lakota and Cheyenne warriors emerged from concealed positions on both flanks. Modern ballistics analysis of the battlefield has revealed the sophisticated nature of the Native American military tactics. Unlike the popular image of Indians as undisciplined fighters, the archaeological evidence shows that the warriors employed coordinated fire and movement techniques that would not have been out of place in a European military manual. The retreat from the valley floor became a massacre. Reno's men, abandoning their wounded comrades and most of their equipment, fled in panic toward the river. The narrow crossing became a death trap as warriors positioned on the high ground picked off the fleeing soldiers like targets in a shooting gallery. Private William Morris, one of the few men to survive the river crossing, later described the scene. "The water ran red with blood. Men were falling all around me, shot down like dogs. I saw Sergeant Miles cut down by a tomahawk blow that split his skull clean in two. The screaming of the wounded men was worse than the sound of the gunfire." Meanwhile, 3 miles to the north, George Armstrong Custer was beginning his own descent into hell. His approach to the village had been carefully observed by Cheyenne scouts who had been tracking his movements for hours. Unlike Reno's frontal assault, Custer's attack was met not with defensive positions, but with a brilliant tactical maneuver that turned the hunter into the hunted. Crazy Horse, the young Oglala war leader whose tactical genius had already defeated one American army, had positioned his warriors to allow Custer's column to advance almost to the river before springing his trap. The archaeological evidence suggests that the initial ambush was devastating in its effectiveness. Custer's men, expecting to find the rear of the village undefended, instead rode directly into a carefully prepared killing zone. Warriors concealed in the ravines and coulees along the riverbank opened fire at point-blank range, dropping dozens of soldiers in the first volley. The forensic analysis of the battlefield reveals that many of Custer's men never had the opportunity to return effective fire. Cartridge cases found near the soldiers' remains show that weapons were fired hastily and without proper aim. Many rifles were found with their actions jammed, suggesting that the soldiers had fired so rapidly that their weapons overheated and became useless. Lieutenant James Calhoun, Custer's brother-in-law and one of his most trusted officers, attempted to establish a defensive position on the hill that now bears his name. The archaeological evidence from Calhoun Hill tells a story of brief, desperate resistance followed by complete annihilation. Bone fragment analysis conducted in the 1990s revealed that many of the soldiers on Calhoun Hill were struck by multiple bullets, suggesting that the warriors continued to fire into the bodies even after death. This was not mere savagery, but a calculated psychological warfare tactic designed to demoralize any remaining defenders. As Calhoun's position was overrun, Custer must have realized that his grand plan had become a nightmare of epic proportions. The sound of gunfire from Reno's position to the south had already ceased, replaced by the war cries of victorious warriors. Captain Bentine's column, which was supposed to provide crucial support, was nowhere to be seen. The retreat from the river to what would become known as Last Stand Hill marked the beginning of the end. Modern computer analysis of the battle site has revealed that Custer's men were not conducting an organized withdrawal, but were fleeing in complete panic. The distribution of artifacts and remains shows that military formation had completely broken down. Native American oral histories, recorded decades later, describe the terror of the fleeing soldiers. Old warriors recalled how the blue-coated men threw away their weapons and equipment as they ran, some even discarding their boots in their desperation to escape the relentless pursuit. But there would be no escape. Crazy Horse had anticipated every possible route of retreat, and his warriors moved to seal off each avenue of flight. The trap was closing, and George Armstrong Custer was about to face the consequences of his fatal arrogance. The slaughter had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Final Stand Unravels. The myth of Custer's heroic last stand, immortalized in countless paintings, crumbles under the harsh light of archaeological evidence. What actually occurred on the hill overlooking the Little Bighorn River was not a glorious final charge, but a desperate and chaotic collapse that stripped away every pretense of military honor. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the remnants of Custer's command had been driven up the steep slopes of what historians would later call Last Stand Hill. The archaeological record, painstakingly reconstructed through decades of forensic analysis, reveals that fewer than 40 men remained alive when they reached the hilltop. The rest had been cut down during the panicked retreat from the river. The physical evidence tells a story that no surviving witness could have recorded. Spent cartridge cases scattered across the hillside show that the soldiers' weapons were malfunctioning at a catastrophic rate. The intense heat generated by rapid firing had caused many rifles to jam, leaving the men defenseless against the closing circle of warriors. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, his golden hair now matted with sweat and dust, found himself commanding not a disciplined cavalry unit, but a collection of terrified men who had watched their comrades die in the most brutal fashion imaginable. The psychological impact of witnessing such overwhelming violence had shattered whatever remained of military discipline. Modern analysis of the battle site has revealed that many soldiers died while attempting to flee rather than fighting to the end. Skeletal remains show bullet wounds in the back, contradicting the romanticized version of events that portrayed every man dying while facing the enemy. The hard truth is that when death became inevitable, many of Custer's men broke and ran, only to be cut down by pursuing warriors. Crazy Horse's tactical brilliance reached its climax during the final assault on the hilltop position. Rather than mounting a costly frontal attack, the Oglala war leader divided his forces into multiple groups that approached from different directions simultaneously. This classic envelopment maneuver, executed with precision that would have impressed West Point instructors, made coordinated defense impossible. The Native American warriors had learned from decades of fighting American soldiers. they understood that cavalry units depended on their mobility and firepower to maintain tactical advantage. By forcing Custer's men into a static defensive position and then systematically eliminating their ability to return effective fire, the warriors had reduced the legendary 7th Cavalry to helpless targets. Captain Miles Keogh, one of Custer's most experienced officers, attempted to organize a final defensive perimeter around the hilltop. The archaeological evidence suggests that this effort lasted no more than 15 minutes before being overwhelmed. Keogh's body was later found surrounded by the remains of his men, struck by multiple bullets at close range. The systematic nature of the Native American victory becomes clear when examining the distribution of artifacts across the battlefield. Warriors moved methodically through the dying soldiers, stripping them of weapons, ammunition, and personal belongings while delivering final shots to the wounded. This was not a chaotic melee, but a carefully orchestrated execution. George Armstrong Custer's final moments have been the subject of endless speculation and myth-making. The archaeological evidence suggests that he was among the last men to die, not because of any heroic last stand, but because the warriors deliberately saved recognizable leaders for last. Native American oral traditions speak of recognizing officers by their distinctive uniforms and equipment. Historical analysis of Custer's remains reveals 2 bullet wounds, one in the chest and one in the head. Both wounds would have been immediately fatal, contradicting romanticized accounts of prolonged final combat. The trajectory analysis suggests that at least one wound was inflicted at close range, indicating that resistance had already collapsed by the time Custer fell. The collapse of the final position was swift and absolute. Within minutes of the warriors breaching the defensive perimeter, every American soldier on the hill was dead or dying. The silence that followed was broken only by the methodical work of the victorious warriors as they moved among the bodies, completing their grim task. Native American accounts describe finding some soldiers who had apparently committed suicide rather than face capture. Several bodies were discovered with self-inflicted gunshot wounds, suggesting that the psychological terror of the situation had driven some men to take their own lives rather than endure what they expected to be torture and mutilation. The speed of the final collapse is perhaps the most damning indictment of Custer's leadership. Modern military analysis suggests that a competent commander with 40 disciplined men should have been able to hold a hilltop position against even overwhelming odds for several hours. The fact that the defense crumbled within minutes speaks to the complete breakdown of military cohesion and morale. As the sun began to set over the Little Bighorn Valley, the hill that had witnessed such carnage fell silent except for the cries of circling vultures. The warriors had achieved a victory so complete that it would send shockwaves across the American continent. But for the men who had followed George Armstrong Custer to their deaths, the silence was absolute and eternal. The myth of the heroic last stand was born in the ashes of military catastrophe. The reality was far darker, a tale of tactical incompetence, psychological collapse, and the brutal consequences of underestimating one's enemies. The archaeological evidence leaves no room for romantic interpretation. This was not glory, but annihilation. The final act of the tragedy was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Aftermath of Annihilation. The morning of June 27th dawned grey and oppressive over the Little Bighorn Valley. General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon, approaching from the north with their combined forces, had been hearing distant gunfire for 2 days, but had no idea of the catastrophe that awaited their discovery. The silence that greeted them as they crested the final ridge was more ominous than any battle cry. What they found defied every expectation of civilized warfare. Scattered across the hillsides and ravines were the mutilated remains of 268 soldiers, their bodies subjected to a level of brutality that shocked even veteran Indian fighters. The archaeological evidence, combined with eyewitness accounts from the rescue force, provides a harrowing picture of what had transpired after the shooting stopped. Captain Frederick Benteen, who had survived the battle by remaining on Reno Hill with the remnants of the Southern Assault Force, was among the first to reach the scene of Custer's annihilation. His written account, preserved in military archives, describes the horror in clinical detail. The bodies were stripped naked and mutilated in the most shocking manner. Many had been scalped, others dismembered. Some showed signs of having been tortured while still alive. The systematic nature of the post-battle mutilation was not random savagery, but followed specific cultural and spiritual practices of the Plains tribes. Modern anthropological analysis has revealed that the mutilation served multiple purposes: preventing the spirits of the dead from seeking revenge, claiming spiritual power from fallen enemies, and sending a psychological message to any other American forces that might contemplate similar attacks. George Armstrong Custer's body was found near the summit of Last Stand Hill, identifiable only by his distinctive buckskin jacket and the remnants of his famous golden hair. Unlike many of his men, Custer had not been scalped, leading to speculation that the warriors recognized his importance and treated his remains with a form of respect reserved for worthy enemies. Historical accounts of Custer's body, examined by the rescue force, reveal evidence of the 2 gunshot wounds that killed him. The condition of his remains showed no signs of torture or extensive mutilation, suggesting that he died quickly in the final moments of the battle rather than being captured alive and subjected to ritual punishment. This evidence contradicts Native American oral traditions that speak of capturing the long hair alive, but supports eyewitness accounts from the burial detail that found his body in relatively good condition compared to many of his men. The discrepancy between oral traditions and physical evidence remains one of the enduring mysteries of the battle. The discovery of the battlefield had profound psychological effects on the rescue force. Hardened soldiers who had fought in the Civil War and numerous Indian campaigns were reportedly reduced to tears by the sight of their mutilated comrades. Several men had to be physically restrained from destroying the entire valley in retaliation. Colonel Gibbon's official report, filed with military headquarters, attempted to maintain the dignity of the fallen by omitting the most disturbing details of their condition. However, private letters and diary entries from members of the rescue force provide a more complete picture of the horror they encountered. These documents, preserved in various historical archives, reveal the true extent of the carnage. The bodies of Tom Custer and Boston Custer, George's younger brothers, were found together near their commander's position. Both had been subjected to particularly brutal treatment, with evidence suggesting that they had been mutilated extensively after death. The warriors' knowledge of their family relationship to the hated cavalry leader had marked them for special attention. Lieutenant James Calhoun, Custer's brother-in-law, was discovered on the hill that now bears his name, surrounded by the remains of his company. His body showed evidence of having been struck by over a dozen different weapons, suggesting that multiple warriors had participated in his killing. The archaeological evidence indicates that he may have been one of the last men to die in that position, continuing to fight even after suffering mortal wounds. The systematic stripping of the bodies had not been merely for material gain, but served as a form of spiritual conquest. Every weapon, piece of equipment, and article of clothing had been removed, leaving the dead soldiers naked and exposed to the elements. This deliberate humiliation was intended to demonstrate the complete victory of the Native American forces. Modern archaeological analysis of remains recovered from the battlefield has revealed insights into the soldiers' lives and deaths. Bone analysis shows evidence of hard living, poor nutrition, and the physical toll of frontier military service. Many of the men were far older than their enlistment records indicated, and some showed signs of previous injuries and illnesses. The psychological impact on the survivors was devastating and long-lasting. Major Marcus Reno, who lived through the battle by remaining on the defensive hill position, never fully recovered from the trauma. His later court-martial and dismissal from the army was attributed partly to the psychological damage inflicted by witnessing the annihilation of his comrades and the death of Bloody Knife. Captain Benteen, despite his survival, was haunted by guilt over his failure to reach Custer in time. His later years were marked by alcoholism and bitter recriminations against the military hierarchy that had sent them into such an obvious trap. The weight of survivors' guilt destroyed many of the men who lived through the battle. The cover-up began almost immediately. Military censors suppressed the most disturbing details of the battlefield discovery, focusing instead on creating a mythology of heroic sacrifice that would be more palatable to the American public. The brutal reality of the defeat was replaced with romanticized images of brave soldiers making a final stand against overwhelming odds. Recent archaeological investigations have continued to reveal new evidence of the battle's true nature. Ground-penetrating radar and metal detection surveys have uncovered additional remains and artifacts that paint an even clearer picture of the events of June 25, 1876. Each new discovery further demolishes the heroic mythology that has surrounded Custer's last stand for over a century. The final irony is that George Armstrong Custer achieved the immortality he had always craved, but not in the way he had imagined. His name became synonymous not with military glory, but with the catastrophic consequences of arrogance and tactical incompetence. The Battle of Little Bighorn stands as a permanent reminder that even the most confident military leaders can be destroyed by their own hubris. The truth about Custer's last moments reveals a man who died not as a hero, but as the architect of his own destruction and the deaths of every soldier who trusted him to lead them safely home.